In a quiet southern town, where the past never truly fades, one teacher dares to challenge the status quo. Eric Williams, the only black educator in a school steeped in prejudice, faces daily resistance as he tries to inspire his students with lessons of equality and justice. When a confrontation with a parent reveals a buried connection between their families, long-hidden truths come to light. This is a story about the power of history, the struggle for understanding, and the unexpected ways our lives intertwine. Can old wounds heal when the truth finally emerges? Dive into a tale that explores the clash between past and present, and discover how one act of courage can echo across generations. Eric Williams stood by the window of his classroom, watching the schoolyard where students played during recess. The sunlight danced on the green grass, but his thoughts were far from the cheerful scene outside. He had always loved teaching, finding purpose in shaping young minds and guiding them toward a better future. However, today was different. A heavy feeling weighed on him, brought on by the confrontation that had occurred just moments before. Eric was the only black teacher at this small-town school located in the Deep South. The town was one where history lingered in every corner, where the past wasn't something easily forgotten. For the most part, Eric had managed to gain the respect of his colleagues and students, but there were always exceptions. People who couldn't look past the color of his skin. From the moment he had first arrived at the school, Eric had felt the weight of being the outsider. His credentials were impressive, and his passion for teaching was evident. Yet there were whispers, sidelong glances, and moments of awkward silence in the teacher's lounge. He had been warned by friends about the town's history, but Eric believed in the power of education to bridge divides. He hoped that by setting an example, he could change the minds of those around him, even if only a little. But the reality was harsher than he anticipated. There were students who refused to listen, dismissing his authority with muttered slurs. Parents who openly questioned his competence, not because of his teaching methods, but because of his race. Colleagues who seemed supportive on the surface, but kept their distance, never inviting him to join them for lunch or including him in their social circles. Each day, Eric faced a barrage of subtle and overt discrimination, and while he tried to focus on the positive, the burden grew heavier with time. Earlier that morning, after finishing his lesson on civil rights and the importance of equality, Eric had been approached by Mrs. Smith, the mother of one of his students. Mrs. Smith was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and a demeanor that radiated an air of superiority. She had stormed into the classroom as soon as the bell rang, not even bothering to knock. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice icy, "I need to have a word with you." Eric turned to face her, already sensing that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Of course, Mrs. Smith. What can I do for you?" "It's about my son, James. He's been coming home with these ridiculous ideas, talking about equality and fairness. Frankly, I don't appreciate you filling his head with such nonsense," she said, her tone laced with disdain. Eric took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had encountered resistance like this before, but it never got easier. "Mrs. Smith, I teach all my students about history and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background. These aren't just ideas. They're fundamental values." Mrs. Smith's face hardened. "Values? You call this indoctrination values? My son has always known his place, and I won't have you changing that. This is not what we sent him to school for." Eric could feel the tension in the room rise, but he kept his composure. "Mrs. Smith, it's important for all our children to understand the history of this country and the struggles that many have faced to secure the rights we have today. James is a bright young man, and these lessons are meant to help him think critically about the world around him." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "My father always taught me to be wary of people like you, stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any. We don't need your so-called lessons here." The mention of her father caught Eric's attention, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he responded calmly, "I'm not here to stir up trouble, Mrs. Smith. I'm here to educate. The history I teach is part of our nation's story, and it's important for all of us to understand it, even if it's uncomfortable." Mrs. Smith glared at him, her eyes narrowing. "I don't care what you think is important. Just stop filling my son's head with this garbage. Otherwise, I'll have to take this matter to the school board." With that, she turned on her heel and marched out of the classroom, leaving Eric standing there, a mix of frustration and sadness swirling inside him. After Mrs. Smith left, Eric tried to refocus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. It wasn't the first time a parent had confronted him, but something about this encounter unsettled him more than usual. Perhaps it was the coldness in Mrs. Smith's voice, or the unwavering conviction in her eyes. She genuinely believed that what he was teaching was harmful, not just to her son, but to the very fabric of their community. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Eric went through the motions of teaching, but his usual enthusiasm was dampened. He noticed the way some students exchanged glances during his lessons, how a few of them seemed to withdraw, no longer as engaged as they had been before. Were Mrs. Smith's words already having an impact? Had she spoken to other parents, spreading her fears and prejudices? The thought weighed heavily on him. After school, Eric stayed late to grade papers, hoping the routine task would distract him. As he worked, the door to his classroom creaked open, and he looked up to see Mr. Thompson, the school principal, standing in the doorway. "Eric," Mr. Thompson began, stepping into the room. "Can I have a word with you?" Eric set down his pen and nodded. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. What's on your mind?" Mr. Thompson was an older man, nearing retirement, with a reputation for being fair but firm. He had always treated Eric with respect, but there had been moments when Eric sensed that the principal was walking a fine line, trying to balance the expectations of the community with his own sense of what was right. "I heard there was an incident with Mrs. Smith this morning," Mr. Thompson said, taking a seat across from Eric. "She came to see me afterward, very upset." Eric sighed inwardly. He had expected this. "Yes, we had a disagreement about the content of my lessons. She's concerned that I'm teaching her son ideas that don't align with her family's values." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, rubbing his chin. "I see, Eric. You know I support you and the work you're doing here. But this town, well, it has its own way of doing things. People don't take kindly to change, especially when it comes to matters like this." "I understand that, Mr. Thompson," Eric replied, choosing his words carefully. "But I also believe it's important for these students to learn about the full history of our country, even the parts that are uncomfortable. If we don't address these issues now, when will we?" Mr. Thompson looked at Eric with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "You're right, of course. But the reality is, Mrs. Smith is not the only one who feels this way. I've been getting calls from other parents too. They're worried, Eric. They're worried that you're pushing an agenda." Eric felt a pang of frustration. An agenda? All I'm trying to do is teach these kids to think critically and understand the world they're growing up in. That's not an agenda. That's education. I know, Mr. Thompson said, holding up a hand. But try telling that to the folks around here. Look, I don't want to ask you to change what you're teaching, but maybe you could tone it down a bit. Focus on the more general aspects of history and leave the controversial stuff out. Eric stared at the principal, a mixture of disappointment and anger bubbling up inside him. "So, you're asking me to avoid teaching the truth because it makes people uncomfortable?" Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture, Eric. We have to keep the peace here, and that means making compromises sometimes." Eric wanted to argue, to stand his ground, but he knew it would be futile. He was just one man, and the forces arrayed against him were too strong. With a heavy heart, he nodded. "I'll think about it, Mr. Thompson." The principal stood up, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, Eric. I appreciate your understanding." As Mr. Thompson left the room, Eric leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. What was the point of being a teacher if he couldn't teach the truth? How could he look his students in the eye and tell them half-truths and watered-down versions of history? The thought made him feel sick. That evening, as Eric sat in his modest living room, he pulled out an old photo album his mother had given him years ago. Inside were pictures of his grandfather, marching alongside others in the fight for equality. There were newspaper clippings, letters, and even a few awards Samuel had received for his activism. As he flipped through the pages, one particular photo caught his eye. It was an old, faded picture of his grandfather standing with a group of people after a particularly brutal protest. In the background, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat: a young white man being tended to by others. Eric remembered his grandfather's stories about how, during one protest, he had saved the life of a young man who had been injured in the chaos. The story had always stuck with him, a testament to his grandfather's belief in the shared humanity of all people, regardless of race. Eric studied the face of the young man in the photo. There was something familiar about him. His thoughts immediately turned to Mrs. Smith's mention of her father and how he had warned her about people like him. Could it be? The next day, Eric decided to dig deeper. He visited the town's small library, searching through old records and newspapers from the era of the civil rights movement. After hours of searching, he found what he was looking for: an article detailing the protest where his grandfather had saved a young man named Thomas Smith. Thomas Smith. The realization hit Eric like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Smith's father had been the very man his grandfather had saved all those years ago. The irony was almost too much to bear. Armed with this new information, Eric knew he had to speak with Mrs. Smith again, but this time with a different approach. After school, he drove to the Smith household, a quaint house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by old oak trees. Mrs. Smith answered the door, her expression immediately turning sour when she saw who it was. "Mr. Williams, what are you doing here?" "Mrs. Smith, I need to speak with you." "It's important," Eric replied, his voice calm but firm. She hesitated, but eventually she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. They sat down in the living room, a tense silence hanging in the air. "Mrs. Smith," Eric began, "I understand that you're concerned about what I'm teaching your son. But there's something you should know about our families, something that goes back many years." She looked at him skeptically, but didn't interrupt. "My grandfather, Samuel Williams, was an activist during the civil rights movement. He believed in equality and justice for all, and he dedicated his life to fighting for those values. During one of the protests, he saved a young white man who had been injured in the chaos. That man was your father, Thomas Smith." Mrs. Smith's eyes widened, her face pale. What are you talking about?" Eric pulled out the old newspaper clipping he had found, handing it to her. "This is from the local paper, reporting on that day. Your father was hurt, and my grandfather made sure he got to safety. They never spoke again after that. But I think it's important for you to know that, despite everything, my grandfather saw your father as someone worth saving." Mrs. Smith stared at the article, her hands trembling The silence stretched on as she absorbed the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never knew. My father never told me any of this." Eric nodded. "I think he probably wanted to protect you from the truth of what happened back then. But Mrs. Smith, the values I'm teaching James aren't just ideas. They're about understanding where we've come from and where we need to go as a society. Our history is complicated, but it's important to face it, not run from it." Tears welled up in Mrs. Smith's eyes as she looked at the photo in the article. I always believed what my father told me about those times, but now I don't know what to think." Eric placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. "It's never too late to learn and grow. We all have the capacity to change, to see things from a new perspective. James is a bright kid, and I want to help him become someone who can make a difference in this world, just like my grandfather did." Mrs. Smith wiped away her tears, nodding slowly. I think my father would have wanted that too. Thank you, Mr. Williams, for showing me the truth." Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere between Eric and Mrs. Smith shifted. She became more involved in James's education, even supporting some of the initiatives Eric introduced in class. Their once strained relationship evolved into one of mutual respect, built on the understanding that the past, while painful, could be a foundation for a better future. And as for James, he continued to thrive under Eric's guidance, embracing the values of equality and justice that his teacher instilled in him. The story of his grandfather's bravery and his teacher's wisdom would stay with him for the rest of his life. A legacy of change that began with one act of kindness many years before.